The Kalmar Union, a Union of Kalmaris, was a state that brought together the Scandinavian nations from 1397 to 1523. It was a personal union that joined under a single monarch the three kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, together with Norway's overseas dependencies. The union was not quite continuous. There were several short interruptions. Legally, the countries remained separate sovereign states, but with the domestic and foreign policies being directed by a common monarch. One main impetus for its formation was to block German expansion northward into the Baltic region. The main reason for its failure to survive was the perpetual struggle between the monarch, who wanted a strong unified state, and the Swedish and Danish nobility, which did not. Diverging interests gave rise to a conflict that would hamper the union in several intervals from the 1430s until its definitive breakup in 1523, when Gustav Vasa became King of Sweden. Norway continued to remain a part of the realm of Denmark-Norway under the Oldenburg dynasty for nearly 3 centuries until its dissolution in 1814. In 1397, the land area of the Union was as large as 3 million square kilometers under the rule of Margaret I of Denmark. Inception. The Union was the work of Scandinavian aristocracy wishing to counter the influence of the Hanseatic League. Margaret, a daughter of King Valdemar IV of Denmark, married King Håkon VI of Norway and Sweden, who was the son of King Magnus IV of Sweden, Norway and Scania. Margaret succeeded in having her son Olav recognized as heir to the throne of Denmark. In 1376, Olav inherited the crown of Denmark from his maternal grandfather as King Olaf III, with his mother as guardian. When Håkon VI died in 1380, Olaf also inherited the crown of Norway. The two kingdoms were united in a personal union under a child king, with the king's mother as his guardian. Later, Olav had designs on the throne of Sweden from 1385 until 1387. Olav died in 1387, before he came of age and could take over the government, so Margaret made the Danish Council of the Realm elect her as Regent of Denmark, but she did not attempt to assume the title of Queen. On the 2nd of February the next year, she was also recognized as Regent of Norway. She adopted her sister's grandson Boguslav, son of Prince Vartislav of Pomerania, and gave him the more Nordic name Erik, and maneuvered to have the Norwegian Council recognize him as heir to the throne of Norway, in spite of his not being first in the line of succession, and he was installed as King of Norway in 1389, still with Margaret as his guardian. In Sweden, this was a time of conflict between King Albert of Mecklenburg and leaders of the nobility. Albert's enemies in 1388 elected Margaret as regent in the parts of Sweden that they controlled, and promised to assist her in conquering the rest of the country. Their common enemy was the Hanseatic League and the growing German influence over the Scandinavian economy. After Danish and Swedish troops in 1389 defeated the Swedish king, Albert of Mecklenburg, and he subsequently failed to pay the required tribute of 60,000 silver marks within 3 years after his release, her position in Sweden was secured. The 3 Nordic kingdoms were united under a common regent, and Margaret promised to protect the political influence and privileges of the nobility under the union. Her nephew Erik, already King of Norway since 1389, succeeded to the thrones of Denmark and Sweden in 1396. The Nordic Union was established on the 17th of June 1397 by the Treaty of Kalmar, signed in the Swedish castle of Kalmar on Sweden's southeast coast, which in medieval times was close to the Danish border. The treaty stipulated an eternal union of the 3 realms under one king, who was to be chosen among the sons of the deceased king. They were to be governed separately, together with the respective councils, and according to their ancient laws, but foreign policy was to be conducted by the king. It has been doubted that several of the signatories were present, and it has been argued that the treaty was only a draft document. It appears that the treaty was never ratified by constitutional bodies of the three kingdoms. The short-term effects of the treaty were achieved anyway, independently of whether the treaty was binding or not, because the stipulations as to day-to-day governmental operations were mostly matters which were in the power of the king to decide. Moreover, until Eric was deposed in the late 1430s, he made decisions as to each of the kingdoms in accordance with the treaty intentions. Long-term stipulations, such as what should happen when the monarch ceases to reign and a new monarch succeeds, were not among those achieved without problems, as subsequent events showed during the next 130 years. At each junction, installation of a new monarch tended to mean a break-up of the union for a while. Eric of Pomerania, however, became the monarch of all three kingdoms. At Kalmar, the 15-year-old Eric of Pomerania was crowned king of all three kingdoms by the archbishops of Denmark and Sweden, but Margaret managed to remain in control until her death in 1412. It is said that contemporaries of the Union would not recognize the historiographic term, Union of Kalmar, that they just understood that much of the time, the three kingdoms shared a common king, while the term meaning Treaty of Kalmar was known already at the time. The term Union of Kalmar cannot be found in any contemporary documents. Conflict. The Swedes were not happy with the Danes' frequent wars on Schleswig, Holstein, Mecklenburg, and Pomerania, which were a disturbance to Swedish exports to the European continent. Furthermore, the centralization of government in Denmark raised suspicions. The Swedish Privy Council wanted to retain a fair degree of self-government. The unity of the Union eroded after the Danish defeat against the German Hanseatic League in the 1430s, even to the point of armed rebellion, leading to the expulsion of Danish forces from Sweden. Eric was deposed as the Union king and was succeeded by his nephew, the childless Christopher of Bavaria. In the power vacuum that arose following Christopher's death, Sweden elected Charles VIII king with the intent to re-establish the Union under a Swedish king. Charles was elected King of Norway in the following year, but the Counts of Holstein were more influential than the Swedes and the Norwegians together, and made the Danish Privy Council appoint Christian I of Oldenburg as king. During the next 7 decades, struggle for power and the wars between Sweden and Denmark would dominate the Union. After the briefly successful reconquest of Sweden by Christian II and the subsequent Stockholm bloodbath in 1520, the Swedes rose in another rebellion which ousted the Danish forces again in 1521, though Stockholm did not surrender until the summer of 1523. While independence was being reclaimed, the election of King Gustav of the Vasa at Strängnäs on 6 June 1523 has been seen as a declaration of independence, and as the de facto end of a union that had lost all long-term support in Sweden. On the day Gustav Vasa was hailed as king, though he was not crowned until 1528. In 1983, June 6 became the National Day of Sweden Dissolution. One of the last structures of the Kalmar Union, or rather medieval separateness, remained until 1536 when the Danish Privy Council, in the aftermath of a civil war, unilaterally declared Norway to be a Danish province without consulting the Norwegian colleagues. Although the Norwegian Council never recognized the declaration formally informally, and Norway kept some separate institutions in its legal system. This had the practical effect that the Norwegian possessions of Iceland, Greenland and the Faroe Islands came under direct control of the Crown. In principle, this meant that the Norwegian Crown, under the Danish Union, was henceforth controlled from Denmark and not from Norway. In the 1814 Treaty of Kiel, the King of Denmark, Norway was forced to cede mainland Norway to the King of Sweden, Charles XIII. Norway, led by the Viceroy Prince Christian Frederick, objected to the terms of the treaty. Her constitutional assembly declared Norwegian independence, adopted a liberal constitution, and elected Christian Frederick king. After a brief war with Sweden, the peace terms of the Convention of Moss recognized Norwegian independence, but forced Norway to accept a personal union with Sweden. In the middle of the 19th century, many intellectuals joined the Scandinavist movement, which promoted closer contacts between the three countries. At the time, the union between Sweden and Norway under one monarch, together with the fact that King Frederick VII of Denmark had no male heir, gave rise to the idea of reuniting the countries of the Kalmar Union, except for Finland, which was annexed by the Russian Empire in 1809 to 1917. In 1953 to 1955, the former territories of the Kalmar Union, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, formed the Nordic Council, a discussion forum for members of the parliaments. In addition, two important treaties were agreed in 1955. First, the Nordic countries were formed as a passport-free zone, which was somewhat similar to modern-day Schengen Treaty. Also, citizens of the Nordic countries were allowed to live and work in any member state without limitation. These treaties still exist, but their importance has waned due to the EU, EEA and Schengen. The background from the treaties was Sweden's need of labor for her fast-growing industry in the 1950s.